Crusades. So what about the Crusades? I mean, the people leave Europe and they go to the Middle East to take back Jerusalem. What was that not an act of aggression?
No, that was actually part of just war theory, because based on what I just was saying, they knew, the Crusaders and the church, that land, the Holy Land, was originally Christian. And moreover, they knew of what was happening, all the attacks and the violence. And in the years and decades before the First Crusade, this is when I was referring to the Turks. I mentioned the Ottomans, but before the Ottomans, you had the Seljuk Turks, and they're the ones who precipitated the First Crusade, because what they were doing is really horrific. According to contemporary eyewitness sources, they were massacring tens of thousands of Christians in Asia Minor, primarily Armenians, Georgians, Greeks in Western Anatolia. And at the same time, there was always pilgrims from Europe going to the Holy Land ever since Constantine the Great built the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem and all these other sites. They had always been going there, even during, the height of after the Islamic conquest. And depending on, who was the ruler at the time, all you have to do is pay money and maybe you can visit, but sometimes you'd get attacked. During this time, right before the Crusade, the Turks were just running havoc, and the stuff they were doing, people would travel thousands of miles, and when they get to the gates, they demand money from them and take it, and then they hit them and whip them and kick them out. There's a very notable story where a German pilgrimage went there. This happened in 1064, and eyewitness says they killed everyone, and there was this beautiful nun, and they gang raped her to death. Okay. And then there's other stories about when they would go into churches and completely defile them and, disembowel the priests and decapitate them, pull the entrails of young boys and whip them around. And that's so, if you really study the text and you look at why Pope Urban called for the First Crusade in 1095, that's why it was, because of what was happening. So in that context, it was seen as just war. This is Holy Land. This was Christian before the Muslims conquered it in 637, Jerusalem. And now they're doing what they're doing to the holy sites and to pilgrims and to Christians in general. And so they would often cite, another verse that they would cite is where Jesus says the two greatest commandments are to love God and to love your fellow man. And that was understood. Loving God in that sense was, a lot of modern Christians don't understand this anymore. But Holy Land, sacred sites were important. Okay, so God was being dishonored in this construct by what the Muslims were doing. So loving God was to go on pilgrimage and liberate the Holy Land. But loving your fellow man, your neighbor, as that verse says, was also in the same context, because you're going to help and liberate the indigenous Christians and the pilgrims who were being abused. So yeah, nobody had any problem with it in that context. The problem is it's not presented in that context. And so I'll leave you with a quick quote from a professor, John Esposito. Maybe you've heard of him, from Georgetown University. He was very popular back in the day when I went to Georgetown University. And, he was the editor of the Oxford Encyclopedia of Islam, the later version of a watered-down version. He has a line in one of his books that says, and I've paraphrased it so much that I've actually verbatim now. He says 5 centuries of peaceful coexistence elapsed between Christians and Muslims until an imperial papal power play, it's an alliteration, led to a series of so-called holy wars that have left a legacy of enduring mistrust and grievances from Muslims. So despite what I just told you, which is Muslims conquered violently 3/4 of the Christian world, okay, and all the atrocities, in 1009, okay, this is again a few decades before the First Crusade, one caliph, a Fatimid caliph in Egypt, according to Muslim sources, al-Makrizi, destroyed 30,000 churches and synagogues as well in Greater Syria, in the Middle East basically, and Egypt, which on the one hand underscores how Christian that region was, as I was saying, and on the other hand underscores the persecution that was going on. So all of that, that's what was happening, and this professor is telling us that before the First Crusade, it was all peace. Okay, and when you see it that way, and that's how it's presented, of course the Crusaders look like the bad guys because they're colonialists, they're racists, they're xenophobes, they're Islamophobes. They're going to a land that they have no business in, and they're engaging in violence. But if you really understand the context, it's the exact opposite.